Welcome to the Lantern Podcast. I'm Ben McMann. If you've invested in a strong Azure foundation, you're probably asking, why does AI suddenly feel harder than it should? That's the premise behind today's conversation and our blog post. Your Azure landing zone isn't broken, it's just not ready for AI. The reality is, AI isn't exposing bad decisions. It's challenging assumptions about how cloud platforms behave at scale. Today, I'm joined by Damien Robinson and Jason Davis to unpack what's changed, where teams are hitting friction, and how to evolve your platform without starting over. So let's dig into it. Damien, what made you want to write a blog post about this topic right now? And what's the core argument you're making for platform and security leaders who think their Azure environment is in good shape?
Yeah, hey Ben, thanks very much for having us on. Look, there was twofold as to why we wrote the blog and what's leading us to having this conversation today. It was really one, it was the brainchild of JD and myself on a road trip back from a customer site that had similar sort of challenges, and the challenges we're seeing with organizations across the gamut of industries right now as AI is becoming more and more prevalent. It's really those that have invested heavily in the original Azure governance, security, and operating models. They didn't really have the same context as what AI has introduced today. So I want to be clear that customers and organizations have done the right thing for the most part. They built the landing zones based on best practice approach, the cloud adoption framework, the well-architected framework. Those environments were primarily optimized for traditional workloads, predictable applications, known identities and identity patterns, stable consumption models, and a lot of human-driven access. And AI really changed that sort of game at that point. And governance wasn't necessarily about subscriptions and RBAC anymore. And security wasn't about it isn't just about human identity. And cost optimization isn't just about reserved instances and tagging strategies anymore. So AI introduces autonomous sort of behaviors to everything that we're experiencing today. And the core message behind the blog is you haven't necessarily and built your landing zone incorrectly. Just AI has changed the way that we actually interact and how we should be governing in the future.
So, how common is this, Jason, where organizations have done the really good work building their initial Azure landing zones a few years ago, but now they're running into some friction and trying to move their AI workloads into production?
It's very common across a lot of industries, and this pattern is repeating over and over. To follow up with what Damien's saying is everybody made the initial leap into the cloud following a certain pattern of governance, and that pattern of governance worked really good. But just like everything, it needs to be iterated on and changed from a new perspective to handle the wider load of AI as it takes on more and more responsibilities for that non-human interaction that Damien talked about. So the platform may be healthy for their traditional workloads, but it just hasn't come from a perspective of what AI can do for them. And because of that, they need to go back and reassess from top to bottom for all the different things that their initial landing zone was done and iterate again so that they know that they're prepared for what the next wave of infrastructure and AI can do for them.
Okay. So, Damien, walk us through what Azure landing zones were originally designed to do, and then what assumptions were baked in, and why do you think those assumptions start to break down now that AI enters the picture?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, originally landing zones are fundamentally designed around control, predictability, and standardization. And the assumption was pretty straightforward. Workloads are relatively static. In my time, I've done a lot of lift and shift from an infrastructure standpoint to the cloud and a lot of modernization. So to JD's points, the scale patterns were somewhat forecastable. Identities were mostly human for the most part. There's principles in there and all sorts of things, and governance could be managed through a combination of policies and process. They work really well for traditional sort of cloud transformation initiatives. Where AI sort of fundamentally challenges those assumptions is the impact that AI has on your data dynamically and dynamically working with your data sources and your data domains. They operate autonomously and continuously. So there's a lot of things you don't necessarily see around what AI is doing in the back end. So it dramatically expands the identity service from beyond service principals and humans to managed identities, agent-based operations, etc. And that's really fundamentally what's changed the operating sort of behaviors of power and what we're seeing from the original landing zone concept.
So, Jason, when you're working with clients, give us some examples of where you see this friction showing up and how these AI workloads actually operate differently than traditional applications do.
Yeah, one of the first things AI does is challenge data boundaries. So a traditional app might live in like one domain, but AI wants to use cases usually across a lot of domains so they can pull context from everywhere to give you the best information across your whole business. That usually means platform teams need to take careful consideration around data classification, access controls, private endpoints, network segmentation, and auditability. So you know that you've got the right data in the right place and it's secure.
So, there's a question for both of you. We'll start with Damien. So, if you had to pick the single biggest behavioral difference between a traditional cloud workload and an AI workload, that one that tends to catch platform teams most off guard, what would it be?
So, I mean, the biggest shift, I think, AI workloads are generally non-deterministic. Traditional applications generally behave in known ways and with predictability. You could predict the model of traffic, access patterns, forecasting of consumption of those services, and define relatively stable sort of trust boundaries or those governance boundaries that we sort of see every day and what we've experienced up until the last couple of years where the shift really has happened. I think where AI changes that is there's access to multiple sort of data domains. I mentioned in a previous question there. There may be an impact on AI triggering inference models that are unexpected, especially if an AI model is learning from real-time data or information that's available on the web, for example. And then scaling really depends on that user demand and automation chains. And from a governance and cost perspective, that sort of breaks a lot of those assumptions where enterprise cloud platforms are generally built around. I think where organizations suddenly feel the friction is moving from AI pilots to AI in production as well. So there's a big shift on actually making that change, especially around those predictabilities of, there's a relatively new concept that's floating around called tokenomics, which is the form of trying to understand the cost of interacting with your AI bots and agents and services.
And so, Jason, I know, we've had conversations before, and you really talk a lot about the identity surface really has expanded considerably with AI. So, can you expand on that a little bit more and how that might affect traditional audit trails?
Yeah, I think the difference is how we're going to approach it is teams need to start thinking about how AI turns the landing zone from a hosting platform into an active decision layer for identity, data, governance, and cost. This means that the whole outlook and perspective on what they're doing inside of Azure needs to come from a new idea of what they're going to look at for scaling and unpredictable nature of what AI can do for you, and then how they can take that, wrap it around their governance and control it as best they can around cost and decision making.
So, Damien, let's start with identity. When you say how AI changes the identity model, what does that actually mean in practice? And why should a security leader be concerned if they think they have identity under control today?
Yeah, it's definitely not a strong point of mine, but I definitely have an opinion that a lot of our customers and the people we talk through across all sorts of organizations, the CISO is quite often left out of that conversation and those identity managers. But it's probably one of the most underestimated risk in AI right now and in environments that have been built. For many years, organizations have based a lot of their identity on the human identity security approach, MFAs, conditional access, zero trust, or just privileged identity management. Now, AI sort of brings in a new category of identities that operate autonomously, service principals, managed identities, AI agents, and just general automation frameworks. So as many organizations have identified, it's much easier to manage a human today because we've built on that than actually managing an AI agent that there's a lot of unknowns. So it's not theoretical. And the security conversations generally have evolved from who has access to now what autonomous systems have access to the systems and how they're governed, and how do we continuously validate and trust it.
And so, Jason, what are the real world risks that you're seeing when those non human and agent based identities aren't managed well? What does the exposure actually look like?
Yeah, this is one of those permission creeps that we see. A lot of teams start with a pilot that grants broad access so they can move fast. And then that pilot becomes their production without anyone actually revisiting the access model. This is where you could see invisible actors in an environment that's not necessarily malicious, but identities that just have access systems that are quite sensitive and not governed the same way human actors could be. Like if people are revisiting what a login might look like and catching those early, they're not really looking for the broad permissions that are given to AI. So in an AI environment, non-human identities just become as important and just as risky as any privileged user.
So, Damien, shifting to governance, one of the topics that you talk to companies a lot about. In the blog post, you make the argument that it has moved from documentation to enforcement. So, why isn't documentation enough anymore, and what does enforcement actually require?
It's probably the biggest mind shift that AI has sort of introduced as it relates to governance. And you can no longer necessarily rely on just documentation and process. So historically, governance has been architectural reviews, Excel spreadsheets, approval workflows, SOPs or standard operating procedures, and a lot of manual oversight and bringing that through generally a governance committee, etc. So, AI systems don't necessarily interpret those the way that humans do as much as we think. The technology boundaries and platforms allow us to shift into a different operating model that sort of does include the AI modeling. So if you think about Azure policies or maybe even your cloud platform of choice policies, identity guardrails and network controls, etc., from an AI perspective, that doesn't necessarily work or it doesn't exist. AI at scale, governance debt compounds very quickly. So the small gaps that are manageable in traditional cloud environments become significant security and compliance risks once AI workloads begin to be operating autonomously and continuously.
And then, Jason, on cost. So, AI workloads seem to break a lot of the assumptions that cloud financial teams rely on. Where do you see organizations get surprised the most, and why do pilots tend to mask how significant that cost exposure actually is?
Yeah, I think the pilot phase can create a false sense of confidence around cost. The platform might support the pilot just fine, but production is where you find out whether you have the right quotas and policies and tagging, cost alerts, chargebacks, operational ownership. AI cost risk usually does not show up in the demo. It shows up when you see the users actually start to engage and use it across your whole business. And it's hard to predict that scale when you're in that pilot phase. And it really shows up pretty quickly once it scales to the whole business.
Damien, when platform teams hear that their landing zone isn't ready for AI, usually the answer might be to start all over. So help us walk through why that's really the wrong call, and how do you help leaders understand the difference between what needs to change and what should stay?
Yeah, that's a good question and something we come up against every day as well. The goal is evolution or evolving versus rebuilding. I think rebuilding from scratch is not necessarily the right answer, and it should never be the right answer. So most organizations have existing, well-architected, cloud-adopted sort of frameworks in place, and their landing zones are very, very solid based on the investments they've made several years ago and have grown. They've implemented the governance frameworks, identity strategies, networking models, and just general operational baselines. And I think it's important that we don't throw away and introduce unnecessary operational risk by rebuilding. And that will also delay further AI adoption, which is a really important thing. If you're going to be competitive in today's landscape and without removing that barrier to be innovative, it's really important. So the real opportunity is really evolving and doing that intelligently, hardening identity. JD and I talk about it quite a bit, the zero trust architecture to the next level, taking governance and converting governance into enforcement, and then proving that AI specific cost visibility as well. So tokenomics, I mentioned earlier, it's a really important one. I've seen a lot of customers reviewed challenge the modeling today because it is a little bit different to the older sort of models that were very predictable. So organizations that will succeed are the ones that rebuild everything, I think, in this instance. So understanding where your gaps are today, and then aligning that with remediation tasks and getting your environment back to where it should be in the era of AI doesn't start with a rebuild.
Anything you'd want to add to that, Jason? I mean, if a customer came to you saying, we want to get AI ready, where do you tell them to start?
Yeah, it's kind of the follow up. This isn't like a rip and replace conversation, it's a maturity conversation. So operationally, someone needs to own that AI platform pattern. Otherwise, every team is going to build it differently, and you end up with inconsistencies among costs, security, support models. So you have to address this from a top down. So getting your identity controls in place, the cost visibility, the AI specific governance, all of that stuff builds into that pattern for you so that you can have that maturity of making sure you're following the right enforced guardrails across everything.
So this one's for both of you too, and Damien, we'll start with you. So what's the risk of moving too slowly here? But also what's the risk of overcorrecting and over-engineering the solution? So how did teams find that balance?
Yeah, this is a really important one as well. I think the introduction of the last 3 years where generative AI and narrative AI in particular has come, it also touched on the consumer almost before it touched on the enterprise, outside of building your own models, etc. And I think AI adoptions, it's going to continue anyways. It's probably just going to continue outside of IT. Shadow AI is a real thing. Business units and teams will still experiment. They'll start using other tools that may not necessarily be sanctioned. And outside of that, and developers will still develop and build models based on enterprise data, and teams will still automate workflows based on the tools they have access to. And if they don't have access to it, everything else is at risk there as it relates to innovation. It slows. Shadow IT and shadow AI become a real part of challenge in the governance strategy that your organization is putting into place. So the balance is probably somewhere between progressive hardening, maturing those governance models at the same pace, or trying to do this at the same pace as AI adoption matures, and then just finding that sweet spot. So there's no right or wrong answer, but I think the question isn't whether your landing zone was built correctly, by the way. The question, or the real question, is whether the governance, security, and cost controls have evolved fast enough for AI in the era of AI.
Jason, your thoughts?
I think the goal is really to build confidence too. So you know that when you are going forward with AI, you're moving to the right direction, following a pattern that's going to work, that gives them the right innovation, controls, visibility, so they can operate and support the platform that they're building without slowing them down with any unneeded operational hurdles. This will help them get what they need out of AI and help the business keep it secure and cost effective.
Perfect. Damien, Jason, thanks so much for the great discussion today. Really appreciate the time. And so to wrap everything up, the question isn't whether AI is coming to your Azure environment. It's whether your environment is ready to support it safely and economically. So check out our blog post. Links are in the descriptions. And also, if you'd like to have some more information, our team is very happy to have a conversation with you about a way to do a quick optimization of your current landscape and seeing where you should be focusing first. So we will see you next time here on the Lantern Podcast.
Thank you.